In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'm going to tell you why the most logical resolution for the Brandon Ingram situation is for him to remain in New Orleans. But will that work out? It's an entirely other question. It's Wednesday's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Wednesday. First and foremost, if you're in South Louisiana dealing with the storm here, I'm riding out alongside with you. I hope you are staying safe. I hope everything is okay. And I'll have some on what we're going to do Wednesday night in a moment here on the show. So please take care of yourselves. We're all hoping for only good things and for this storm to pass very quickly. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And of course, become an everydayer of Locked On Pelicans. That means you listen Monday through Friday. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. So, by the way, just let's get this part out of the way. With the storm going on right now, if we have power, big if, I guess, with all this as I'm recording at about 6 o'clock on Tuesday, if there's power, if I have power, if you hopefully have power too, on Wednesday night, we'll do a live show. Let's ride out the storm together on a live episode of Locked On Pelicans. So go to the YouTube page and you can see the link that should be up and bookmark that. So we'll see you. Let's do like 6 or 7 p.m. I'll put it up after that and try and ride this out a little bit together with everything. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans, we are going to look at the Brandon Ingram situation from two angles. One, why it's likely that he's going to remain here in New Orleans, and it has to do with other NBA teams. And then how do you deal with that if maybe he doesn't want to be here? All of that sort of thing. And then we're going to get into Joe Mazzulla, the head coach of the Boston Celtics, who was on Locked On Celtics. What a good get. Said some insane things that I think the Pelicans maybe need to look at a little bit here with all of that and apply to their approach this season. So let's get into the Brandon Ingram situation, dilemma, whatever you want to call it, right? Things, I don't want to say are starting to get ugly because I don't necessarily think that they are, but there's definitely some like butting of the heads when it comes to this. Ingram skipping the team workouts in California. And again, that's okay. You know, posting the video on social media for the everydayers. You know, we talked about that last week. It's not great. But here's the thing. They need to, both sides, Ingram included in this, need to just kind of get over it and probably come together. Because right now, in my opinion, just based on reading the league, it's likely that Brandon Ingram stays. You know, I'm taking a trade off the table here because if there was a trade that made sense, you know, as of now, it would have happened and he wouldn't be on the team and we would be talking about different things. But that just has not materialized, right? Around the league as a whole, they have said, like, you're not worth the $208 million, which Jamal Murray just got, by the way. That's just the situation here. So no team wants to trade him or trade for him and pay him that. And if he's going to stick to that number, he's coming back to New Orleans. And the most likely situation here is that they just agree to a deal that's going to be less than his max. You know, I've looked at this. We've talked about this on the show of what that number could look like. Go listen to the old shows. If you didn't, if you're an everydayer, you know what that number is. And I come to this, not realization, but looking at this, you know, saying he's likely to stay is just, where else is he going to go? If you're not moving via trade, it's via free agency. And there's no money next offseason whatsoever. When you look at this, the money has dried up and most players realize that and are signing extensions with their current team. When you look at, you know, kind of cap space projections for next year, you have the Nets with around $40 million. And after that, there really isn't anyone else. You might see some projections right now that have the Rockets making with $30 million in cap space, the Wizards with about $26 million in cap space, or the Spurs with about $23 million in cap space. But let's run through those teams really quickly here. You know, when you have the Rockets with $30 million in cap space. That's not including Fred VanVleet. That's him opting out of his contract and becoming a free agent where he's likely going to re-sign with them. They also have big extensions coming for Jalen Green and Alperen Şengün after this year. So it kind of just eats up their money very quickly. The Wizards, maybe, but that's not an appealing situation. And they only have $26 million. That's less than what Brandon Ingram is making right now. They just simply can't add him at $40 to $50 million in free agency. Then the Spurs, Sohan is eligible for an extension, which is going to eat some of their money up. But again, that's going to put them in a $15 million range, something like that, probably less than that. There's just no money out there. There's no money out there. And that's why you've seen players that would have been free agents in 2025 signing extensions. Jason Tatum, the list isn't extensive, right? Jason Tatum, Donovan Mitchell, Lauri Markkanen, Jalen Brunson, Anthony Davis, Damian Lillard, Derek White, Zubac, Andrew Nembhard, TJ McConnell, Sam Hauser, Jonathan Isaac, and now Jamal Murray. These players realize they need to stay with their teams because there's not money out there for them to go and get. Ingram needs to realize the same. This is one of the, you could call it unfortunate side effects or just side effect of the new collective bargaining agreement, is that free agency, and it hasn't really existed for a while, free agency just isn't going to fully exist like it used to. The Paul George situation is very much an outlier, and you're rarely going to see that repeated, and that was more of a mistake by the Clippers than anything else. Players just usually sign an extension, then get traded later. That's how players are moving right now. Ingram needs to realize that. You've long heard me say this is how he ends up taking a mid-level exception deal in free agency, $12.8 million. That's far less than the $40 a year he could get here in New Orleans on a deal that I think is fair to both sides, $40 to $45 million a year. Not the 52. 40 is a great number for the Pelicans. It's more than he's making right now, and it's far more than the $13 million on average that a mid-level exception deal would take. When you just look around the league, in terms of cap space, there's one team, and that's the Brooklyn Nets. And they're kind of going all in on rebuilding. They have a bunch of draft picks. Maybe that's just the route they want to go. Maybe you could put Ingram on there to kind of lead that young team, but I don't think that that's truly what they want to do. Ingram's real only option to get a big money deal right now, to me, seems to be the New Orleans Pelicans. They're not going to pay him the max. That means you've just got to sign something and get paid whatever it might be. And I think that's ultimately what's going to end up, maybe happening here, is that he signs a below max deal that's kind of fair to both sides, and there you go. That's that. But when you look around the league, looking at the cap space, looking at how the collective bargaining agreement works, there's just nowhere for him to go. You want to get some money. I've talked about this extensively on Locked On Pelicans here for the everydayers, right? Sign the extension. That's, 20% of the cap for New Orleans. Get as much money as you can, not the max, but the most that you can. That's what that is. It likely means when you look around the league with no trade materializing and then no money next year, resign, and then you can force your way out later if you need to, or just get traded later, not this coming season. So we're likely to see Brandon Ingram on the team this season and the playoffs as well. So if he's on the team, what then? What then? Are these, do both sides hate each other? Is there a way to make the fit work? There's a balancing act here. Let's get into that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Gametime. Look, live events, whether they're sporting events, whether it's comedy, theater, concerts, more, Gametime is the way to go and get your tickets. This is my new go-to ticketing app. I've used it multiple times this year when people are telling me the Pelicans games they want to go to. I'm telling them, use Gametime to get your tickets. It just takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. It makes it super easy for you. And that's what I love about it. There's all-in pricing, which when you opt into it, you see the all-in price with fees included up front. You can see the view from your seat. So if you're going to a venue that you are not familiar with, a location you don't know, you can see the view from your seats and get exactly what you're looking for. They also have the curation, which makes it easier to save on more sports, comedies, theater, and more. So you can go through the app and they're going to recommend really great deals and events for you. So curated deals makes it easier to find the best price on great seats. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And don't forget, tonight, as we're riding out the storm, let's do it together. Live episode on Locked On Pelicans. Let's do 7 p.m. Central Time. I think that'll be a good time to do it. And hopefully we'll all be safe and sound and have the power on. Now for your second listen, I'm on Locked On NBA today. We're talking and looking at the Jamal Murray extension and how it impacts the Nuggets and why I think they're doing the correct things. So Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. Stay informed, stay entertained with Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we just talked about how likely it's going to be that Brandon Ingram remains with the team this season. Maybe even signing an extension so he's here for the long term. This isn't without risks though, right? Will this work out is another really valid and open question. I want to look at some of the logistics with that of, okay, say he's going to be here. Now what, right? What's next? The now what is always kind of a big question here. And it's interesting to see how this could work out because there needs to be a balance, right? Ingram is not just a role player. He's not just a guy that comes off the bench or does anything like that. This is a talented scorer, and I do think the pendulum has swung a little too negatively on him overall. There are flaws to his game, no doubt, but he can be a very talented and useful player. And look, a couple of years ago against the Suns, he was fantastic in the playoffs. But does he fit around Zion? And that is who the team is building around. There needs to be a balance here. There needs to be a balance of him fitting in a little bit better, changing his shot profile, fitting in around Zion and what the team wants to do offensively. But there also does need to be the Pelicans catering to him slightly. I don't think to an extreme of at times let him cook and let him go and get his. And that means this is going to be a challenge and kind of the charge for the Pelicans here from the front office to the coaching staff to figuring out what that balance is. First and foremost, I think everyone can just get over this summer. It's a business. This is how it goes. And players will just get over it. It's really as simple as that, right? If Ingram wants to get the max money he can, whether it's on his next deal or maybe he signs a shorter term one here, whatever it is, it's go out and play well and win and fit into this team. Everyone has seen who he is at this point, and the NBA has collectively been like, yeah, no, that's not what we want at that price. There are players who get paid more money that are more complimentary, know that they're kind of number two on the team, and that's fine. Go and show that you can do that, and players and teams will want you because you're conducive to winning. And I'm not saying Ingram isn't conducive to winning, but again, this team hasn't won anything, and the lack of cohesion with Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson, I think, is part of the reason why. Figuring that out is going to be the most important thing, other than health, for the Pelicans having a successful season. On Ingram, that means he needs to buy into what they're doing as a team more. He needs to get over the feelings, needs to, have some introspection of what he can do to become a better player or fit this team and help them win. That's going to lead to him getting paid. On the Pelican side, say he doesn't do that, they need to have, I don't want to say a hardline stance, but something along those lines. They need to be firm of like, you need to fit in, you need to do what we need you to do and want you to do, and not you just go rogue. And look, he didn't do what they wanted him to do last year. He didn't take the threes that they were begging him, telling him to take. And it led to them just kind of abandoning some of their offense. You can't do that. If that happens this year, you've got to sit him. Whether that's just, it sucks having a guy making $36 million just sitting on the bench, but they need to kind of take a bit of a stance like that. Like you saw with Ingram, who had been hurt, not playing well against the Lakers, just being sat down the stretch as they came back from double digits down and almost won that game. You need to be able to do that and feel empowered as a head coach to do that, which ties into what we'll talk about next. And that's how they're going to have success. If Ingram isn't fitting in, you can't let him derail what you're trying to do. And look, his play style by himself doesn't derail it. But the Pelicans did not achieve what they wanted to achieve last year. And as I've repeatedly said on the show, I thought last season was a disappointment despite making the playoffs because they didn't reach their full potential. It felt like they left a lot on the table, and that's not what you want here. If they had kind of maxed out their potential last season, still lost, I wouldn't call it a disappointment. You did everything you could. Now it's time to redo the roster or change and raise your ceiling here. But they didn't even reach that. They need to reach that this year. And if Ingram at times is hurting you or just isn't fitting in and you're not scoring like you need to, then it's time to put him on the bench. That's going to be a challenge. It's not an easy thing to do. Very few head coaches would feel empowered to be able to do that. Anyone in the league, right? We'll see if that's kind of the stance they need. But there's also going to be times when, look, Ingram is who he is, and you know that, flaws and all with the player, so let's kind of build around that. Can you run him leading the second unit? Not coming off the bench, but maybe you pull Zion, CJ, Murray, and let Ingram cook with some other guys. Can you put shooters around him and let him facilitate like we saw last year as kind of the point forward? I think the answer could be yes. So can you run some lineups where Ingram is the main guy? Will he kind of fit that style, or do the mid-rangers mean maybe that doesn't quite work? How do you kind of find those balance where to let him be him? Let him be him. There's times when that's going to be a useful player and a needed player. So find lineups where that works and let him know how it's going to go. And then at times be like, you're running the show. Okay, Zion's on the court. Like, let's work around him a little bit. Here's this other situation. This is what we need you to be then. And find kind of that buy-in from him when it comes to that sort of thing. So it's, as I said, a balance, right? You got to let players be who they are. To Ingram's credit in that, whatever the pastor thing was on Instagram, right? Like, this is what we've said about Zion, right? Like, you want to maximize what he's really, really good at. And that's, to me, getting to the rim. That's why I'm like, I don't really care about him shooting threes a ton, because that's never going to be as good as him going to the rim. Same thing with the mid-ranger, right? Maximize ways to get him to the rim and put players around there that make it easier for him to get him to the rim, right? When I say Ingram needs to shoot more threes, from the Ingram fans, the counter is like, well, then you should say Zion needs to shoot more threes. No, you want to maximize what players are good at and what fit your team. And so with Ingram, that's true too. If he wants to be, the mid-range artist and the scorer like that, put him in position with lineups that maximize that. It's harder when it comes to mid-range jumpers, but there are times when you can kind of build around that. So build some lineups, build your rotation with that in mind a little bit. You don't want to cater to that fully. That doesn't need to be your number one thing, but I do think there are times when you can leverage that a little bit and lean into it. So do that. He's happy that way. You're maximizing his talent. Now, you can also maximize his talent by him just shooting more threes. That would go a real long way towards making him a better player. That would help him. I mean it. And he's proven he can do it, where Zion hasn't really proven that he can shoot threes or be an elite three-point shooter or anything like that. Ingram actually has. He just chooses not to. So again, the whole theme of this segment, right? Balance, balance, balance when it comes to those sorts of things. They need to find that, or they need to kind of have that line in the sand of like, we're going to sit you down if that's not the case. Because based on what we talked about in that first segment, they're likely to be together this year. Beyond that, who knows? Ingram wants to take that risk. I don't think that's smart. No one is doing that, right? The other big name here are the other free agents. Ingram, you could argue, is going to be number one in this class. Ben Simmons is 2, but is that like a reclamation project and kind of scary? Brooke Lopez at age 38 next season. Clint Capella, Malcolm Brogdon. Bruce Brown is good. Miles Turner, but he's likely going to re-sign with the Indiana Pacers. Lonzo Ball has missed 2.5 years. Tim Hardaway Jr. is now in Detroit. D'Angelo Russell is a free agent. Karis LeVert, Luke Kennard. It's a terrible free agent class. It's a terrible free agent class for the most part. No team wants to go in with $40 million and be like, we're going to sign all the guys that we want, because you don't necessarily want those guys. Ingram could take that risk. If I'm his representation, absolutely not. Because that's how you end up getting signed for the mid-level exception. Because teams, if they have cap space, will use it. I would not be shocked if the Brooklyn Nets take on bad contracts, rent that cap space out to other teams for draft picks. And that's going to leave even less money for Ingram. Literally, the only way players are going to change teams next summer is minimum contracts in the mid-level exception. Pretty much just that. There's no cap space out there. Ingram should take the money here in New Orleans, or really is taking a big, big risk. We'll see what ends up happening. So let's switch gears. Coaching a little bit. Joe Mazzulla, championship-winning head coach of the Boston Celtics, was on Locked On Celtics with my good friend John Krause. One, you should go listen to that show. If you don't, you want some of the cliff notes, we're going to talk about that, but how it applies to the Pelicans. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by eBay Motors, my favorite because they keep my cars on the road. I got an old car I'm fixing up. Super easy to find the parts there. You wouldn't think it, right? Car that's almost 50 years old, you can find the parts easy. Whether it is a new windshield, whether it's the passenger window, which I've recently replaced, whether it's just brake parts so that I feel safe when I'm driving. eBay Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. So whether you're looking for speed, power, style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you're always going to find exactly what you're looking for. And with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. And with eBay Motors, the prices are so good, you're burning rubber, not cash. So with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP. Keep your vehicle alive over at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Live show Wednesday night while we're hopefully all staying dry with no damage and the lights are on Locked On Pelicans. We'll do the bonus part where I chat with y'all. Let's ride out the storm together here. Now, your second listen today, Locked On Saints. Y'all, I was not expecting that on Sunday. Ross Jackson kind of was, though. And he explains why on the Locked On Saints podcast, why you should have expected more from the offense, because he's been boots on the ground watching this team all off season. We finally got to see it in practice. Go listen to Locked On Saints for everything black and gold with host Ross Jackson. So let's start to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. I want to get into coaching a little bit. You know, I've long said, and this is kind of my belief, that there are 5 coaches that help you win. There's 5 coaches that actively harm you. And then there's 20 coaches in the middle. And truthfully, I think Willie Green is one of those 20 coaches in the middle, though I couldn't necessarily tell you where he is. Top 15, I'm not sure. But I don't know if he's actively harming the team like some people think. He also has the best winning percentage in franchise history in terms of coaching record. So there's something to be said for that. One guy that is helping teams win is Joe Mazzulla. Joe Mazzulla of the Boston Celtics, you could argue, is a top 5 coach in the league. It's probably Popovich, Spoelstra, Mazzulla, Mike Malone in Denver, and I'm probably forgetting someone who's also there pretty good. Maybe Thibodeau too in New York. That might be. I got to think more about the coaches to be like, yeah, that's my top 5. But those guys are all at least in consideration for it, I think. Mazzulla just winning the title, running away with the season with the Boston Celtics. He just went on the Locked On Celtics podcast and gave like a pretty crazy interview. Like he comes off as a madman, but in a good way. Like I really encourage you. It's broken up into 2 parts, like a 40-minute total interview. Really encourage you to listen to that because it's just wild to hear how some of these guys are just wired differently than normal humans. You know, in talking about the title, so one of the takeaways I have was his mentality on how he approaches and views things. And we don't know if Willie Green has or doesn't have this mentality, but sometimes you just need to be a little bit vocal so fans can hear it and feel good. And Mazzulla did that in this interview. You know, one of the things he was talking about was title defense. They're defending the title, right? And he doesn't view it as that. You know, And I kind of like that approach, right? Like they won the title last season. A new one is up for grabs this year. So when you kind of think of title defense, you're defending Teams are coming at you. And he was saying in this interview, that's not how like the animal kingdom works, right? The top animals are always aggressive, attacking, and going after it. And they're not just sitting back like defending. Not the best analogy, but I get what he's trying to say. And I kind of like that, right? He wants that team coming in hungry. Now that players have won their title, won their ring, if they hadn't already, they're like, oh, we've been here before, we know how this goes. And that's how you skip steps and become a little bit complacent. And that leads to a new NBA champion next year. We've had 6 different champions in 6 seasons now. Never really have seen anything like that in league history. So he knows how hard it is. So Joe Mazzulla is already kind of laying the groundwork for what his team needs to do coming in. It's interesting that he's kind of done the work in the offseason. He knows that, they need to take a different approach. They're going to be the same team. They're basically the exact same team, but they're going to need to kind of have a new voice. If he comes in and acts exactly the same, says the exact same things, it might not work. Now that circumstances have changed, that they've won a title. So he's already kind of like planting the seeds for what they need to do and be next season. And also, look, NBA players being at like the top of their profession, a lot of them hungry and want more and always want more, like the idea of being aggressors, I think. Most people probably do. And so Joe Mazzulla was saying, that, yeah, they don't have just a target on their backs. He wants the target on their foreheads. Said he's like, I want to see the laser between my eyes of teams like, pointing weapons at you and things. It's like, again, you got to listen to the interview. The dude's kind of like crazy. I love it in a good way. Bringing that kind of aggressive attitude is what I'd like to see a little bit more of with the Pelicans. And I'm not going to get into like Willie Green's comments of like, give him credit and all of that, because I think that's overblown. One of the things I thought you saw from the Pelicans last year was them being too reactive rather than proactive. And so this gets to the larger point of the conversation here. They need to be more aggressive, more proactive, and not responding to what other teams do, but go, we're going to make you respond to me. And I like that kind of attitude. And with players that can be really unique and talented with this team, Zion Williamson is one of one in the NBA. Make teams adjust to him. Okay, you've done that? Cool, we're going to throw another wrinkle at you. And maybe that is now DeJounte Murray. Maybe that's letting BI get going once they've taken away Zion and it's freed him up a little bit more. Those are the type of things that I want to see this Pelicans team do. Oh, we're down double digits for whatever reason. We're going to go and we're going to take that lead back by outscoring you. And not through defense feels a little bit more passive. That's the type of attitude you'd like. And again, whether Willie Green is like that or not, I couldn't for sure tell you, right? Just because he's not vocal or saying this stuff in the media doesn't mean he's not telling that to the players. There's so much that goes on behind the scenes, far more than we actually see. And that's worth keeping in mind when it comes to this sort of thing. But you got to listen to that interview with Joe Mazzulla. One, that's just like a heck of a get for a Locked On show. We're big. That's great too. But just a fantastic interview with some like incredible quotes and that mentality. Go listen to what he talked about with a Broadway show. Going to a show on Broadway and what he was thinking while watching that, to hear how some of these people are just wired so differently, always on, always looking for an edge and all of that. It's pretty interesting stuff. So go give that a listen. Wanted to plug that here on the show, but to also tie it to Willie Green. I do think this team needs to be more in your face for opponents next year, for opposing teams, and set the tone rather than react to the tone. And I think that's going to be really important. Keep that in mind when we get to next season as we're evaluating head coach Willie Green, who does need to show us something this year. So let me know what you agreed with. Let me know what you disagreed with in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. That's going to do it for this episode. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. Stay safe. Please, please, please stay safe. The lights are on. We'll do a live show Wednesday night so we can ride this out together. Looking forward to chatting with y'all. I'm anticipating we'll be able to do that, so that's maybe a good thing. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. See y'all tomorrow.